With mythology back in the spotlight, our next panel takes a look at reinventing mythology, the art of rewriting religious narratives. In this session, we have Paul Zacharia. He's a Malayalam writer and columnist known for taking a non-conformist stance in political commentary and for the use of unconventional themes in his fiction. The author of over 40 books, he has received the Central and the State Sahitya Academy Award, among others, and his works have been translated to several Indian and international languages. Veenapani Chawla. She's an actor, director, choreographer, writer, and composer, and the founder of Adi Shakti Laboratory for Theatre Art Research in Pondicherry. She is an exponent in Mayurbhanj Chow, Kalari Payattu, Kudi Attam, and Dhrupad singing. Among the awards she has received are the Z. Astiva Award in 2006 and the Sangeet Natak Academy Puraskar in 2010. A.R. Venkatachalapathy is a historian, author, and translator, and professor at the Madras Institute of Development Studies, Chennai. His works include In Those Days There Were No Coffee, Writings in Cultural History, and In the Tracks of the Mahatma, The Making of a Documentary. He also edited the volumes The Province of the Book, Scholars, Scribes, and Scribblers in Colonial Tamil Nadu and Chennai, not Madras, and translated Sundara Ramaswamy's J.J., Some Jottings. In collaboration with M.L. Thangappa, he has published 2 volumes of classical Tamil poetry in the Penguin Classics series. He is the winner of the V.K.R.V. Rao Prize in 2007. K. Satchidanandan, who will moderate this session, writes poetry in Malayalam and prose in Malayalam and English. His book, While I Write, New and Selected, came out in 2011. He was the chief executive of the Indian National Academy of Literature, Sahitya Academy, and the director of the School of Translation Studies, IGNOU, Delhi. He has won 27 literary awards, including the Sahitya Academy, Kerala Sahitya Academy Award, Knighthood of the Order of Merit from the Government of Italy, and India-Poland Friendship Medal from the Government of Poland. The stage is yours.
Dear friends, the panel has already been introduced. I don't think I need to reintroduce them. Now you are going to know more about them through the kinds of views they have on this whole question of reinventing mythology. The Karl Marx once famously said in his Grundriss that mythology might not survive scientific reason. Of course, with the examples of Jupiter and Vulcan, he said in the age of electricity and of steam engine, maybe these gods who used lightning as weapon and who were famous for their creativity might not have any more place in human society. Even though he knew very well the power of mythopoeic imagination, but as we very well know, mythology has survived not only Marx, it has survived science, and it continues to have a kind of impact on almost every field of life, on religion, from religion to politics. In fact, every field is in some way impacted by mythology and by myth. I'll not go into a discussion, an academic discussion of the idea of myth here, because in common sense parlance, myth means simply falsehood. When you say, well, it's just a myth, it would often mean it's a lie, it's falsehood. While to someone like Roland Barthes, it is any kind of semiotic construction with an ideological content. And in fact, it was Barthes perhaps who extended the definition of mythology to include all kinds of discourses, or discourses with science. And you have, at least the academics among you have read Cassirer or Fraser or Vico or Frank Kermode, all of whom have extensively discussed the question of myth and also its relationship to literature in general, how myths and literary creations have been having an organic kind of link. This has been a constant and recurring theme in critical discourse across languages. And myths have also been looked at for their metaphorical wordplay, like Wickard does or Schlegel does. They looked at myth as essentially a metaphorical wordplay, and it has also been looked at as a kind of symbolic consciousness, just as Jung did or Ernest Cassirer did. And we know very well that myths are also part of everyday. Mythology is, in some sense, part of everyday, because we, even in our everyday conversation, we refer to mythical characters, and a single reference to an episode or a mythical character suddenly illuminates a whole personal or social context. When you speak of Kumbhakarna or the relationship between Rama and Lakshman, or about the abandoned Sita, or about Shambhuka, or about Ekalavya, you suddenly seem to bring to mind a whole host of human situations, contexts, and dilemmas. And so I don't think we have any escape from mythology, escape from the characters that we have lived with, characters from Ramayana or Mahabharata or the Bible. We have phrases and idioms which have come from these great epics, like when we speak of Kumbhakarna's sleep, or when we speak of Abel and Cain. There have been throughout history myths continuously being referred to in order to clarify or to explain certain situations that we come across in everyday life. And today, perhaps myths are being reinvented from very different ideological context than they ever had been. Like Ekalavya coming up as a major protagonist in Dalit discourse, particularly in Dalit poetry, and to some extent in Dalit short story. Or Shambhuka, again, Rama's sense of justice being questioned by making references to what he did to Shambhuka or what he did to Bali. Again, Rama is questioned on the basis of what he did to Sita, who was abandoned when she was carrying. And so you find a lot of new heroes and heroines, both in feminist literature and in Dalit literature, who have emerged from mythology and have been invested with the new kinds of connotations and new kinds of meanings. Perhaps this exactly is the power of myth, because myth is essentially polyphonic, it is polysemic, it has many meanings, it has many dimensions, many voices, and it can be interpreted in different ways in different contexts of life and of history. And you find in contemporary Indian literature a lot of examples of works of fiction and works of poetry which have taken off in some from mythological stories and contexts. If you look at Mahabharata, you have, for example, a play like Anthayug by Dharmavir Bharati, where he takes a context from Mahabharata and turns it into a kind of metaphor for contemporary human condition. Or look at Girish Karnad's play Yayati, or Sridhamshu Yashchandra's Gujarati series of poems called Jatayu, or Balamani Amma as Maruvinde Katha, the story of an axe, where she deals with Parashurama in order to make a comment on the violence that we face in the 20th century. Or Ayyappa Panikar's Kurukshetram, or V.S. Khandekar's Yayati, Shivaji Savant's Mrityunjay, Pradiphare's Yajñaseni, M.T. Vasudevan Nayar's Vendamoolam or Second Turn. So there are a lot of similar works which have taken characters or situations from Mahabharata, and so too Ramayana. C.N. Srikanthan Nair has a whole trilogy based on Ramayana, reinterpreting some of the situations and characters in Ramayana. And Sarah Joseph, another Malayalam writer, has a whole series of stories where she has taken women characters from Ramayana and tried to look at them afresh, including those who were considered villains, like Manthara, for example. So she has placed them in new situations. Sita or Manthara, Shurpanakha, most of those characters have been given new meanings and new contexts and interpretations. So revisionist myth making, if I can call it so, is a part of the kind of innovation that has been happening in literature in recent days. And sometimes counter texts are produced as a result of this attempt, like Vishwanatha Satyanarayana in Telugu wrote this famous work Ramayana Kalpavrikshamu, against which Muppala Ranganayagamma wrote the text Ramayana Vishavrikshamu, which Ramayana as a poison tree, which was a completely antithetical view of Ramayana. I mean, against the status quoist vision of Ramayana itself. So, well, there is mythology can be used sometimes to it can be put a conservative use to explain and sustain the status quo, but it can also be used to subvert the status quo and look at reality in absolutely new kinds of contexts. And perhaps it is in this kind of an intellectual and creative context that we are looking at this whole question of reinventing the religious narratives and the mythology in new contexts and giving them new kinds of meanings and connotations. We have with us three very creative kinds of people. We have Paul Zacharia, who has already been introduced, who is one of the finest fiction writers in India today, also a well-known social commentator. So I would like to begin with Paul. Because he himself has written at least two major stories based on biblical situations, and in Malayalam generally there is the culture of the Bible, which has gone deep into Malayalam literature. I mean, there is hardly any writer who has not somewhere touched Bible, one situation or one character in the Bible. So I would like Paul to tell us something about his intervention in the Bible, and how did he dare do that? Also, the church in Kerala being so strong, did you have problems with the church when you tried to look at Bible afresh? And what is your own take on the Bible characters and the Christian and the church in general?
I think what happened is that I have had to first reinvent myself before I could try and reinvent Christian narratives. For me, this was necessary. This kind of a reinventing of myself was necessary in order to work out my freedom from the agendas built into or superimposed on the Christian religious text that I have been reading, I have been subjected to. Especially this becomes very important, very necessary when one grew up in the faith represented by the text. Like I was born into a Christian background and I was confronting the Christian texts. Otherwise, what happens when you try to use these religious texts is that the hegemonies that are already there, they take over. And you end up talking the same language and representing the same agendas, consciously or unconsciously. It was therefore a process of confronting the religion I grew up with. I don't think anyone engages in such a confrontation for the sake of writing only. Maybe there are such confrontations, but in my case it was not so. I did not. What I was trying to do was, it was an attempt to reinvent myself intellectually and spiritually so that I shall enjoy more inner freedom as a human being. But if you happen to be a writer also, then this freedom, what this freedom gives to you is that it removes the tag holy within quotations from a lot of fascinating material at the root of religions and opens them up for you. These things are not holy anymore. That is what happens. So I must say, for me as a person and as a writer, the acquisition of this freedom was tough. It was quite hard. Perhaps it had to do with the religion I was born into, that is Catholicism. It is something that gets instilled into you from your day one, so to say, on earth. I don't know if it's the same with other religions. And I am not saying this to criticize religions. I know they are only doing their respective jobs, and lots of people like them. And what is more, it is very, very dangerous these days to criticize religions. They hit back with a ferocity we don't associate with a godly or saintly occupation. But I am sure that is part of progress. In Catholicism, the process of faith starts with baptism, something that happens to you when you are just a small bundle of potential humanity. And as you grow up, you go through an organized and rigorous religious training. Family prayers, saints, Sunday Mass, confession, funerals, weddings, baptisms, festivals, etc., etc. You are embedded in religion, and religion is embedded in you. It is so embedded that you don't even realize it is there. You actually start believing that there is a heaven and God sits there. There is hell and the devil sits there, and that Jesus of Nazareth was not a man but God, that his birth was the result of a miraculous non-biological event. And if something doesn't happen to you to wake you up and to get you to question yourself and the beliefs you got used to, then you just end up being a blind believer. I don't think a writer can afford to do that. If you really believe the Bible, or any scripture for that matter, is holy and beyond question and God's word, how can you approach it with an open mind? My feeling is that if you are a believer in a religion or ideology, there is little chance that you will bother to check out the facts about the beliefs you hold as true. That is how faith works. It can be very lazy. Some people can even be scared to undertake such a checkout because of supernatural fear. I have experienced that. I didn't want to go to hell and get burned alive, or I didn't want Satan to apply third-degree methods on me because by questioning this. But I was lucky. I was a bookworm, and my reading and some good friends made me wake up and start questioning my religious beliefs. It took many years, but it was worth it. Once I gained some idea of how religions in general and the Catholic Church in particular were manufactured, I could read the Bible like I would read Hemingway or L. Stanley Gardner. I found out that vulnerable people like me had sat down and written the things in the Bible, and I would be doing them an injustice if I took their writing as God's word. They were doing a job, and a very hard job, because they had to make impossible things appear real. Well, to make an extension, which may be unnecessary, but to make it more contemporary, what they were trying to do, making impossible things appear real, was something like the media today and Mr. Modi, I would say. I personally would feel very silly if someone called my writing God's word. I know the possibility is remote. I know my word is just Microsoft or Madhuri Malayalam, and it is not God speaking through me, but all the writers I have read and all the things I have seen, heard, and known. Once the holiness illusion drops off, religious texts become very interesting creative material. I am not saying that holiness doesn't produce creativity. Some of the finest art in the world has come out of the need of religions to embellish their image. The artisans who made the great Nataraja or Michelangelo himself, they were not carrying out a religious act, but doing a creative job for religion. Their individual genius produced great beauty and meaning using the religious template. Artists like them created the magnificence that gave religion its awe-inspiring profile. The Catholic Church itself is a great example, the Renaissance center. So these artisans, they were also reinventing and re-narrating religious texts. It's over. Once I had reinvented myself, it was a pleasure to open the Bible and hunt in it for all kinds of things. And to me, Jesus of Nazareth is a multi-talented genius. Storyteller, if you read the New Testament, you will know. Storyteller, poet, thinker, orator, lover, dreamer, revolutionary, and self-appointed martyr, all rolled into one. And his genius reinvented God, a new kind of forgiving and loving God who was utterly different from the savage God that Jesus inherited. The God who said, eye for an eye and tooth for a tooth. That Jesus changed. It was of no use, but still he did it because he was a dreamer. So I found it very interesting and challenging to portray him as the human being he could have been in a few stories and short novels. Because I liked the man, that's the only reason I did it. Answering Sachi's question, I have faced opposition from the church only once. And that too because the media acted as a spy. Because the church doesn't read. Basically, it doesn't read. So some friends in the media went and told the bishop, look, Zacharia has written something terrible, you should do something about it. So the bishops got up and started shouting. That's what happened. Then they stopped it because then they knew that I was getting all the advantage. So they stopped it also. But I must say, to be fair to the church, it does exhibit a good degree of tolerance to secular literary interventions, even if it's a bit negative. At least till now it is so. And as I think, as most of you know, the new Pope seems to be a different kind of person. He could hold out some more hope, I think, for the church. Thank you, that's all.
Thank you, Paul. I think he has given us much to think to, along with, of course, much to laugh, especially problematizing the relationship between theology and aesthetics. Well, I think that is one point perhaps that we need to address in the coming presentations. Can I ask Veenapani Chawla to make the next presentation? She, as you know, is, of course, it has been introduced. She's a choreographer, a major innovator of theatre, and she has a whole laboratory for theatre arts called Adi Shakti. And she has been dealing with mythology, in fact, all her life. And I'm sure she has a lot to tell us about how she came into mythology and what the way in which she looks at it.
Well, as you were told, much of my work has been with mythology, South Asian as well as Greek. I look at myth as a body of knowledge expressed allegorically. And I believe that knowledge exists a priori. And so when it gets created into easily digestible symbols, metaphorically and poetically, it has the capacity, the seed of knowledge has the capacity to evolve along with human thinking. As human thinking and consciousness grows and evolves, we find myth resonating with our thought because it is in seed form. It has been expressed in symbols which can be unpacked. And it is in the unpacking of myth that I'm interested. I'm going to talk about ideas really, behind one production that I did in 1998 called Brianala. The ideas in this production dealt largely with mythic figures like Ardhanarishwara, Sabyasachi, and Brianala. To my mind, these are concepts. They are ways of viewing reality. And I'd like to discuss all these three one by one before we come to a conclusion about them. I'm not going to talk about the production because it was 15 years ago, just the ideas. What is Ardhanarishwara? It is, the iconography shows you the left side as female and the right side as male. So we have here a breaking, possibly, of the binaries of gender and an attempt to give one a total view of these two polarities, a wholeness, a union to these two polarities. Sabyasachi, again, is a binary term. It is a name for Arjuna. And it means that he's ambidextrous, I'm told. He can shoot with both hands, or he can shoot with the right hand and play the veena with the left hand. Now this term, this concept extends the term of Ardhanarishwara into capacities and functions and processes of knowing, which is further extended by brain lateralization theories. These theories tell us that the left hand, right brain, has a capacity for processing knowledge in spatial terms, in terms of space. They involve the process of contemplation or of seeing everything all at once, which is what happens with metaphor, myth, art, music, playing the veena, particularly in this context of Brihanala. And the right hand, left brain, has the capacity to see things temporally, one at a time. It requires the capacity of focus and concentration. And in this process of knowing is involved science, language, because this is a focus on one point and then the next and the next. So it's a temporal, linear process. And also there is involved the science of warfare and therefore of shooting arrows in this case. Now, William Blake, I think, said, time is a man and space is a woman, giving us a parallel text thereby for these two categories of polarities being united. One category being the gender polarities, the other being the category of the capacity for knowing in different ways. And he has extended this, he has helped us put Ardhanarishwara with Sabyasachi. Now, what do these two concepts of Sabyasachi and Ardhanarishwara speak to us about in our times? They are talking about putting together two extremes, of trying to give a wholeness to two extremes, which is a particular way of seeing reality. And I would say that contemporary thinking, having inherited European epistemology, is not capable of doing that. It cannot escape the division of good versus evil, right versus wrong, subjective versus objective, in here versus out there, and the either-or logic. In this thinking, extremes can never be united, and consequently, it is increasingly intolerant of opposite positions in thought, politically and socially. I'm coming now to Brihanala. In the 13th year of his exile, Arjuna had to live incognito, because he was, that was the term of the exile. All the brothers had to live incognito. So he used a curse which was given to him, and he became a eunuch in that 13th year. He also made use of the music lessons that he had received in heaven at the same time as he received the curse. He became Brihanala, a female impersonator who would teach singing and dancing and tell stories at the court of Virat. One could say that Brihanala apparently connects to Ardhanarishwara because Arjuna is masquerading as a woman and thus uniting the genders, or that the etymology of Brihanala is Brihad Nara, or great man or Purusha, which can only be Shiva. While all this may be true, I have another take on this. But before going into that, let me explore the connection between Sabyasachi and Brihanala. Here again, the relationship could be because of the union of dualities in both. While Sabyasachi unites capacities and processes of knowing, Brihanala unites genders associated with those capacities and processes of knowing. For Arjuna was an expert in warfare, in the shooting of arrows requiring abilities of focus and concentration, and he is also a singer and dancer. And now I come to the main point of this discussion. I had always felt intuitively that there was much more to this concept of Brihanala than the replication of the union of polarities represented by the other two concepts, and also that the three together created something new. What I asked myself are the implications of the two concepts of Ardhanarishvara and Sabyasachi. Are they merely two binaries put together? The iconography of Ardhanarishvara is certainly disappointing. It does not show us a third something beyond the combination of half of this and half of that. Neither does Sabyasachi suggest anything other than a coming together of two halves. And then, is that a whole, is the question. There were three things which inspired me to look differently at this trio. In the physics of today, there is an acknowledgement, almost for the first time in Western thought, that polarities can indeed be united through an excluded middle ground. Additionally and pertinently to the current discussion, the theory of relativity also breaks the absolute quality of the polarities of time and space. In an artist's response to the notion of the excluded middle ground between two polarities, there are the painting of escher, such as sky and water, where foregrounded birds morph into foregrounded fish by gliding through the middle ground, where the two take on ambiguous shapes. In our own tradition, the concept of Ganapati, Lord of the Threshold, recognizes the importance of the middle ground, the threshold, the space of transition and fantastical variation. In my opinion, the significant space of the excluded middle ground, uniting polarities, indeed gliding through them and thereby creating a new whole, is an important perspective of reality. Troubling the boundaries and definition of each polarity, it relaxes the absolute position of extremes, political and social. It allows for variation and ambiguity and alterity, and it is Brihanala. She, he represents the ambiguous in-between space of binaries which provide us with alternative solutions beyond the accepted and known and expected. Thank you.
Thank you, Veenapani ji. Mythologies can be secularized and they can be read in secular ways. So can be the Bible, as Paul was saying. How is it? How was it, or is it being done in Tamil literature? Or maybe you, of course, you can speak about other literatures too. But you have been a translator of ancient Tamil literature and also contemporary Tamil literature. You have translated Sangam poetry, you have translated Sundararamaswamy, and you are also a cultural historian. And so from a cultural historian's point of view, maybe with the help of a few examples from Tamil, would you be able to make a comment on this whole topic? You can also, it's not obligatory that you go there, but
better writers and artists. Vanakkam. Sachi at the outset referred to the opposition between myth and science, myth and reason. And as a historian, I also remember how old-fashioned historians talked about the opposition between myth and history. But one other opposition which comes to mind is also the opposition posed between myth and modernity. It appears commonplace that the myths cannot survive in the modern. But if we actually look around, it is very easy to see that we live by myths. Without myths, it would be very difficult to live. Because myths are a very important, interesting way of contending with the outside world, our past. And by contending with our past, we are also able to negotiate our present and our being. This is especially so when society is modernized. And I would actually go a step forward and say that contending with myth is one way of becoming modern. But each society handles it in very different ways. There can be trans-spatial comparisons, but since Sachi at the outset had said that I should talk about Tamil Nadu, I would talk about the contention with modernity through myths in the Tamil context in the 20th century, and use three kind of models, the model of rejection, the model of inversion, and the model of appropriation and critique. Once when talks about rejection, the immediate name that would come to our mind is of course Periyar. And I am reminded of something that happened about 20-25 years ago when VP Singh had broken out of Congress. One of the many sidekicks of Rajiv Gandhi referred to VP Singh as Vibhishan, the younger brother of Ravana who betrayed him. There was a huge furor because in most parts of India, Vibhishana is not seen as a betrayer. But I was reminded of how Periyar, in his writings extensively from the 1920s until his death in 1973, not only used the term Vibhishana repeatedly to talk about traitors and backstabbers, he also went a step forward. Of course, he was drawing from a long tradition in Tamil history. He went one step forward and called with great amount of sarcasm, Vibhishana Alvar. And also he was fond of using the term Hanuman to refer to such people. So this is the model of rejection. Of course, Periyar took it to its logical extreme of rejecting myths by calling for and actually burning texts like Manusmriti, Ramayana, Mahabharata, breaking the idols of Pillayar, burning the pictures of Lord Ram. This is the rejection model. But within the same tradition that Periyar comes, there is also the model of inversion. Two instances I could cite. One is Pulavar Kudandai, a great scholar, part of Periyar's movement. He rewrote Ramayana, called it the Ravana Kavyam, where Ravana is the central figure, Ravana is the hero, and Ram is the villain. Unfortunately, Pulavar Kudandai was a great scholar, but was not a great poet. But still it was a kind of backhanded compliment, because if you read Ravana Kavyam, you can see that it is actually in a sense, a backhanded compliment given to Ramayana. The third name which would come when one talks about the model of inversion is Bharatidasan. Bharatidasan writes a play where Hiranya is the hero and Prahalad is the villain. The fifth columnist, if you will permit a slight pun on the column. So you have this model, but this is the rejection cannot be complete. Rejection is absolute rejection is, if I may say so, absolute impossibility. Because when at the same time when he was criticizing Ramayana and Mahabharata, there was a scholar called T.K. Chidambaranatha Mudaliyar, TKC. He produced a new edition of Kambaramayana where he removed 7,000 poems from the 10,000 poem corpus, saying that they were all interpolations. So when this happened, the first person to take cudgels against this was not the Ram devotee Rajaji or Kalki, but it was Bharatidasan. He was the first one to criticize TKC for doing this, and in fact made here I'll have to slip into Tamil. He said, Raman kettadu Kaikesiyala, Ramayanam kettadu TKCyala. So this is one other model, rejection. Inversion. it cannot be translated. The third model would be the appropriation model, which is the most complex, subtle, nuanced one. In fact, if you look at the history of modern literature and all Indian languages, you'll find that all the modern writers, the short story writers, novelists, not so much poets, they have tried to contend with myths, rewrite them, in the process of rewriting them, critique them, appropriate them. So you can take any number of examples, many of which was listed by Sachi at the beginning of this discussion. But one myth, I think, has had pan-Indian resonance in terms of rewriting has been the Ahalya myth. We are all familiar with that story. This Ahalya myth has been rewritten in Tamil a number of times. But in the case of Pudhumaipittan, the great Tamil writer, he rewrites it twice in a very short writing career. At the beginning of his writing career, he rewrites the Mahalya story in a very, very short form, in a very pithy form, barely running into 3-4 pages. In this rewriting, at the end, when Gautama finds out that Indra has cuckolded him, he's deceived him and his wife, he actually forgives Ahalya. And actually Ahalya and Gautama joined together once again, and he is seen in a very he accepts the failing, and he accepts Ahalya as she is. She is not turned into stone. But 10 years later, some people see this as a very radical aspect of Pudhumaipittan's writing. But 10 years later, he writes another story called Saba Vimochanam, can be translated as deliverance from sin or curse. So this is a much longer story, extremely well crafted, not written in a hurry as
I'm getting warnings from the timekeeper.
Yes, okay. So very quickly, what happens is at the end, Ahalya is shocked that Lord Ram, who redeemed her from her sin, actually is the person who makes Sita undergo the fire ordeal. So this is one problem that she has. And the most important aspect is, even though she has been saved she has been redeemed from being a stone, the psychological trauma of the people looking at her from all around and pointing to her as Ahalya. So she of her own accord becomes a stone. So the question one could say is, she was delivered of sin, or she was delivered of curse, but was she delivered of sin? The point I would like to make is whether one can be delivered of myth. Thank you.
Thank you. I really wanted a discussion among the panelists, but I don't think we have the time. But maybe we could take a couple of questions. Not many, but maybe 2 or 3, but be brief and to the point.
Hello, sir.
And tell me also to whom the question is addressed.
You're talking about Sabyasachi. You're right that it means ambidextrous. But Arjuna was a very big failure, though he was capable of using 2 hands. Because when Ekalavya shot a dog with 5 arrows, just looking at the direction, he went and begged, and he was jealous with Dronachari, saying, go and get his finger. So in that way, Arjuna was very weak, and Sabyasachi didn't have any meaning for that. And 2, in Mahabharata's, the war strategy is used in Indian military, sir. It's exactly used. There's a book written 400 pages about it. Thank you.
Would you like to react? Yeah, it's fine. Any other question?
Yeah, one more. Hello, here. A fine evening to all the panelists. I have a very short question. It is from a story writer's point of view. The question is this: most of the legends or the gods that we grew up learning, most of these gods were first written about in Sanskrit or in very old languages. And most of the rewritings of these narratives took place in local languages, local Indian languages. Now the rewritings of these narratives in English, maybe because they were written in local languages earlier, seem awkward. Or conversations between the characters in the English narratives of these stories seem awkward. For example, imagine a character in an English narrative telling his friend that he just dodged an arrow. Now, dodge is a word, it is an English word, but it sounds awkward or it stands out. So my question is this, if these stories are being written in English or in some other languages which are not Indian, is there any technique that can be employed to retain faithfulness in the story? I hope I'm clear with this question. Thank you.
Yeah, we'll take it as a comment. That will be the last question.
Yeah. I have a question for Zacharia. Is getting offended a part of being modern? Getting offended by retelling of myths. Is it a new phenomenon? Or how do you?
Yeah, I think lots of people are getting offended on very small matters. And I think it applies to politicians, to religion, castes and religions and everything. But at least I don't know the national picture, but if you go by the Kerala experience, I would say the phenomenon of getting offended gets, it is made into a larger than life affair by the media. So there are lots of people who are getting ready to get offended and who indulge in getting offended because you become a celebrity by being offended. So that is...
Thank you. I think we will close it here, and I'm sure maybe men get more easily offended than gods and goddesses when you reinvent mythology. Thank you. I thank the panelists and I thank all of you.